Homage watches, they seem to be everywhere these days. Some folks love them, and some folks don't. What is an homage watch exactly, and when is it okay and when isn't it? Let me explain. What is an homage watch? An homage watch is a replica or reproduction of a classic design from the past. It can be anything from approximately close to the original to very close or even indistinguishable from the original. Usually, an homage watch updates the classic design with modern materials, modern manufacturing, and often with less expensive or more widely available movements. Now, if an homage watch is produced by the same brand that made the original, it's usually close cosmetically, but generally, modern movements are used and the watch is often upsized from the original. There are two kinds of homage watches. First, there are watches made by the company that made the original. Secondly, there are watches made by a different company, which are usually a lot less expensive than the original would be if you could get the original at all. Examples of the first type include the Vacheron Constantin and Seiko 1921, the Vacheron Constantin 222, many Seiko homages to their own vintage divers. Omega made an homage to one of its vintage movements with the caliber 321 Speedmaster. Sometimes brands have entire collections based on vintage designs. The Longines Classic Heritage Collection, the Grand Seiko First limited editions. And usually these get a pass from collectors. Often, there's a lot of enthusiasm, as long as the brand itself doesn't overdo it. Usually, there's pretty universal agreement that a brand has the right both de facto and de jure to resurrect its own designs. This gives collectors the opportunity to experience vintage designs, but with the assurance that they're getting reliability and durability, which are usually better than in vintage washes. And there's no concern about servicing or reliability over the long term. The downside is, if a brand overdoes it, it leaves the brand open to the perception that it doesn't have any new ideas. Examples of homage watches made by a different company can be very, very varied. Often, but not always, different types of sports watches fall into this category. They tend to be much less expensive than the original. The problem is, they can make you feel a little bit like you're settling. Some watch designs are so famous that they've become more or less community property in the larger watch world. For instance, the Cartier tank. Generally, homage watch brands devote most or all of their production to making homage watches. For instance, Furlan Mary makes Patek 1463 homages, although they have branched out recently to start creating their own collections, which are vintage adjacent and have vintage details like being mechanical, having center seconds hands and sector dials, but which aren't based on any one single vintage model. Probably the most well-known and most debated of recent homage watches was not a sports watch. It was the Messina Lab and Revolution Uniracer 1949. Now, this was a replica of a vintage Patek 130. It was not a one-to-one copy. Basically, everything was different except for the dial, but it kind of encapsulated everything people both love and hate about homage watches. First of all, it was a chance to experience a classic design. You could actually buy one, since you definitely couldn't buy the original, and the original may have been a one-off anyway. And it was something which, even if you own a vintage reference 130, you can actually wear without worrying about damage or loss. Copying such a rare design didn't sit well with some people, though. The usual objections voiced were that there was a lack of imagination, that it represented a cash grab, although it's hard to see how that could be. My personal take is that homage watches by other brands are usually fine because they don't actually devalue or threaten the original brand. First of all, prices are usually wildly different. Secondly, homage watches by definition are branded differently. Thirdly, the only downside to an homage watch is that wearing one can be a disappointing experience because you can feel as if you've settled, although I can't imagine that anyone would feel that way about the Uniracer. A critical point to remember, I think, is that homage watches are not fakes. They don't want to be taken for something they're not. Instead, an homage watch at its best is a way of letting people who might not otherwise have a chance experience the beauty of a vintage design. And that, I think, is a wonderful way to pay homage to the fine watchmaking of the past. See you next time.